Hi class, and welcome to the recorded lecture for a little bit of an introduction to the presidency. And then also we are going to go over the exam study guide. I have not had any questions via email for that. If you do have questions, please let me know when you can. The exam will open tomorrow, Friday, March 12th at 8 a.m. and it will close Monday, March 15th at 11:59 p.m. So you really have all 4 days to do it. Pick any time that you want where you have an hour free without distractions and where you have good internet, and go ahead and get on and do that. The exam will take 60 minutes. It'll probably take less than that, but you have 60 minutes. It will be timed and it will automatically submit after the 60-minute mark. And there is a timer there, so it will warn you when it's going to do that. That said, let me give you a quick introduction to the presidency. We will continue to talk about the presidency the week we get back, so no other assignments besides the exam for this weekend. And then the next week we'll talk about the bureaucracy, which is really under the president's purview. So it's, again, talking about the executive branch and the president over again. So that's the glimpse of the next 2 weeks. I'll have the folder up for that as well. So here's the materials that I want you to review for the test for presidency. My notes, just one page. Obviously, an important thing to look at regarding what I think is most important in the presidency folder. So if you can just take a look, it's just one page, presidency. It has sort of my thoughts on the growth of presidential power, which I think is the most important concept that we'll be talking about this week. Concerning the growth for presidential power, I will make the argument in class to you personally, but I'll also make it now, that the growth in presidential power is the single most unintended consequence of the way the Constitution is written. And I think it also has the biggest impact on our democracy and how our democracy has changed over the course of the past 225 years. It's essentially the growth in presidential power has been exponential. I really like the way that the two professors discuss presidential power in this video here, the expansion of presidential power bad for democracy. The professors here go into great detail about what the founders expected the presidency to look like, which was a small guardian of democratic ideals and the Constitution, to essentially veto immoral legislation or unconstitutional legislation. It was to be a quiet guiding force against Congress amassing too much power and passing, quote, bad laws. Within about 20 years, the president completely changed any kind of vision of that role being what the president would be. The president became the party leader. The president began campaigning and making policy promises. And so now the president of the United States is the leader of the majority, the leader of the party. Ideally for the president will be the majority party in Congress. And the intention is to pass laws of your party and stop laws of the other party. It is no longer thought, and it very quickly was not thought, that the veto would only be used in rare circumstances to stop an overly powerful Congress. Now the president is expected to use the veto at every turn in order to make his or her party more successful and happy with their representation. I really encourage you to go back and look at this video if you haven't already, or if you didn't get a lot of ideas from it. Is the expansion of presidential power bad for democracy? It presents a very balanced view from two very high scholars of the presidency. These other videos are the crash course videos from PBS. They're excellent, and they nicely dovetail with your textbook information. Let's take a look at these Electoral College materials. So there is an Electoral College video. And while you're watching this, I want you to think about the following questions. Why did the founders initially want an Electoral College? Who did it benefit then? why do we still have an electoral college today? Who does it benefit now and why? Remembering the idea of the president as being a elite, educated, wealthy guardian of the constitutional values and high morals and principles, the Electoral College was decided to be the body that would elect the president rather than having the president elected by the people. It isn't the concept we have today where we think of the president as being elected by the people because we vote based on a ballot. And then the Electoral College sort of shifts how much representation each person gets. Originally, the Electoral College was really thought of as a group of people who would be wise and pick the wisest person among them to lead the party, or to lead the nation. I'm sorry, not the party. Today, rather than choosing Electoral College members and then they get together and deliberate and figure out who they're going to have be the president of the United States, we as people go in and vote for the president. And technically we vote for electors, but in almost all cases, in almost all states, those electors are bound to vote with the people who voted for them, rather than being able to vote, quote, their conscience, vote who they think would do the best at the job, etc. They are bound to do what the people of their state told them to do. So it's a very different system where the president is accountable to the people, but through this kind of very misunderstood, disproportionately represented body called the Electoral College. To be clear, the Electoral College is actually made up of real people. And when you vote for the president of the United States, you're actually voting for the person you would like to go vote for the president of the United States. So if you are voting in the North Carolina's election, it appears as if you're voting for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, but really you are voting for the elector who will then go and vote for that person. So we vote usually the first Tuesday in November for the president, and we feel like we're voting for the president, but it isn't until December that the Electoral College actually goes and casts their vote for president, and it isn't official until that happens. Let's take a look at the Electoral College map that I had given you from Slate. Now, Slate is not a particularly moderate website, so I normally wouldn't put you here for news, but this data is unbiased and it's accurate. I wanted you to take a look at this Electoral College map and really explore the concept of representation on this map, and who is represented more compared to who is represented less. So on this page, we have a color-coded picture of interactive map of the United States. Those who are more overrepresented are represented by the dark green color, and those who are underrepresented are represented in more and more increasingly pale green all the way to white. So let's take, I pick on Wyoming all the time. I'm going to do it again. Let's pick on Wyoming. Oops, excuse me. Who has the highest representation in the Electoral College, which also, if you'll remember, means they have the highest overrepresentation in the Senate as well, because the Electoral College gets its numbers from the number of people that that state sends to Congress. So in Wyoming, they have one House representative, and they have 2 senators. So when voting for the president, they actually have 142,741 people per electoral vote. I don't know where you guys grew up, but I grew up in a small, a medium-sized town in what is North Florida, but is probably closer to considered to lower Alabama. And it's a town called Pensacola. It's, you know, it has a university, it has a mall, it has a couple of high schools. It's like a kind of quintessential size American medium town. and it has more than 142,000 people in it. And it's just a small piece of one district in Florida. And so if you think about Wyoming has 142,000 people per electoral vote, that is not very many. That's an extraordinary overrepresentation in Congress, or in Congress, but also incidentally to the Electoral College. Let's take a look at California. The 49th highest voting power, there's 508,344 people per electoral vote. California has 53 representatives, and each of them represent about 750,000 people. And so 508,000 about per electoral vote. Let's check North Carolina just to see how we are. We are the 45th highest in vote power. We have nearly 500,000 people per electoral vote. So you can just go around and just see there are many states that have quite a bit fewer people per electoral college vote, and that means individuals have more power. Now, in these bigger states, they still have actually physically more votes, where California has 53, Wyoming only has 3. So the power does vary state to state. For now, that's what I really wanted to talk about, the Electoral College and the president's expanding power. We'll continue to talk about the president's expanding power and institutional solutions for making the presidency the best institution it can be, whether that means shrinking the power or something else. We will talk about that when we meet next week, and continue to talk about that when we talk about the bureaucracy. In the meantime, the thing everybody's worried about, let's talk about the Exam 1 study guide. The exam will cover the founding and the Constitution, Chapter 2, Federalism, which is Chapter 3, Congress, which is Chapter 12, and the Presidency, Chapter 13. Please consult all relevant videos, notes, and other supplementary materials from the hybrid course, including your lecture notes. For the founding, the role of trust in a democratic government really comes from the videos, particularly the TED Talk video with the man from the British Parliament, as well as the lecture that I gave on just how important trust is to a democratic government. To jog your memory, we talked about the difference between authoritarian governments and democratic governments and what do they need. Authoritarian governments need fear and the fear of force in order to enforce their borders. Democracies require trust in our democratic institutions, including elections, voting, and the institutions themselves like Congress, the presidency, and the Constitution. The failures of the Articles of Confederation are written about not extensively, but in detail in my notes. You'll remember that Shays' Rebellion was the conflict that we spoke about in class and in the supplementary materials that highlighted a lot of the failures of the Articles of Confederation, including the inability of the national government to collect taxes and raise an army. Once those things were revealed to be major weaknesses, it was seen that the states were not so friendly at all if they didn't have to be. And so a tighter, more central government was created under the Constitution after the disagreements and debate occurred between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the national newspapers. If you are having trouble remembering the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist arguments, remember the Federalists were for bigger central government. The Anti-Federalists were for smaller central government and stronger states. There's a quick reference table in my notes and in your textbook about the Federalist and Anti-Federalist arguments, but then of course you are also supposed to play the game with iCivics, picking a side on that argument. And so those arguments are available to you as well through the iCivics game. And then finally, a major theme of the entire course is this constant conflict and battle in democracies and in the United States of liberty versus equality. Now, luckily, both liberty and equality have grown exponentially over the course of our country since the founding. We have more equality and diversity of rights in the United States than any other year or day before. And we also have more liberties like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. All of that has increased exponentially. But in the moment when we are making in the moment decisions about taxes, about women's rights, about healthcare, about education, usually the arguments are centered around whose individual liberty is going to benefit versus whose group equality rights are going to benefit. As for federalism, remember that federalism is the system of sharing power between the regional governments and the central government. And this, in our country, we call that the state governments and the federal government. What events have limited states' rights? Well, in class, we marked it with a timeline, very specifically showing that the Civil War curtailed states' rights. The states' rights side lost and had to sign constitutional amendments saying that the federal government had more power and that the state governments were not allowed to discriminate birthright citizenship or voting, or that humans could be property based on race or nationality. The Commerce Clause was something we didn't talk about too much in class, but it is extensively spoken about in your book, and it's in my notes. The Commerce Clause is an enumerated power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. And over time, Congress has used this pretty successfully over and over again to curtail states' rights and give Congress the right to regulate commerce, from anything from agriculture to race-based discrimination in private companies, to taxation, the legal driving limit, the legal drinking limit, the speed limit. All of these things through the Commerce Clause, the federal government has really taken over states' abilities to regulate among themselves, particularly in questions that pertain to race-based equality. The states have lost almost every single one of those battles. What are the current controversies surrounding federalism? Well, I would encourage you, to check back into your federalism folder and think about the crash course in my notes on federalism when you're thinking about what are the current controversies on federalism. But specifically, we also talked about it in the More Perfect Union that video, that there are some very specific federalism issues going back to maybe a couple of decades that seem to really hold the country their interests. So we're talking about gun legislation. So some states want to have much higher gun restrictions than others. And the Supreme Court has largely told them that that is not allowed, that states don't have that power. Marijuana legislation. It is illegal at the federal level to buy, sell, or grow marijuana, and yet it is allowed by certain states. And those people just aren't going to jail right now. So it's a very unusual controversy there. And then finally, with the coronavirus, there's obviously been some very intense federalism conflicts going on between states who want to become more, who are trying to be more safe, and states that would rather have it more open versus the federal government's recommendations. Specifically, we can see the federal government's recommendations change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, from encouraging more openness to encouraging more mask wearing and possible closures. Finally, I have dual versus cooperative federalism. This probably would have fit in better at the top here, but it's there. Dual versus cooperative federalism is the evolution over time from the states having certain rights and the federal government having certain rights and obligations to them being a little bit more mixed up. So for example, let's take education. Education used to be completely in the purview of the states. The states were in charge of funding and administering public education. As it became apparent that the economy was changing, the world was changing, and in order to be competitive, students really needed to have a certain standard of education and level of education in the United States in order to be competitive in the job market globally and increase our economy. Education standards started to be the purview of the federal government. This didn't start with No Child Left Behind, but No Child Left Behind was a huge push from the W. Bush administration to standardize education around the United States. And since then, that has been changed to Common Core and will probably change again. But essentially, the federal government says, these are the standards that you have to fulfill. Here's how you have to teach your students. And largely, states, you're in charge of implementing it, paying for it, and training the teachers. So the states really get the short end of the stick on this question of increasing power of the federal government. Really gives states more to do, or about the same amount to do, and less choice of how to do it. Moving on to Congress, gerrymandering definition and consequences. Gerrymandering is obviously the drawing of district lines, election district lines to benefit one party over another. I have extensively given you extensive information on gerrymandering. There is one whole folder on it and then plus another whole slideshow on it. Your book talks about it. There's a video on it. And we talked about it in class. So if you have questions about gerrymandering, either email me specifically or ask a friend. We've gone over it quite a bit in class though. So please consult your notes or a friend's notes. The filibuster and its use today. Again, another piece of information that we have gone over a lot in class. The filibuster is the ability for one senator to delay or obstruct debate of legislation. Any senator can do this unless there are 60 votes to stop the senator. So the Senate is a supermajoritarian legislating body because it needs more than a majority to function and create laws. The controversy today is should we end the filibuster? And I expect you guys to have those arguments in mind. If not, please consult a friend and get notes. Having the two-party system, why we have it and its pros and cons is another piece of information that we do have a whole folder on. Let me be clear so that you guys know exactly where to find it in case you say, what are you talking about? We don't have any of that. I don't want you to feel that way. It's right here in the first Congress, part 1, my notes on Congress, gerrymandering materials, video, a challenge, and the challenge explained. Two-party materials, why we have the two-party system and alternatives to the two-party system. And filibuster information. What is the filibuster? And I went into much greater detail of that in class. And I'm actually going to post my notes that I give my Congress course, just in case you really want to, you weren't there and you really want to see that. Here's another deep dive on gerrymandering. I apologize if you can hear my children. They are on spring break apparently, and I am not. So they're yelling in the other room. The Constitution of the United States set a standard of government, and it really goes through just how we got to where we are with gerrymandering, even though we really are truly mixed up as humans in the United States, of blue and red and green being the independents. So Republicans and Democrats and independents really are mixed up, and yet we still have very deeply blue and very deeply red districts. Well, why is that? It's because of the way that they're drawn. Differences between the chambers, the House and Senate. This is something I did in the notes, and it's something I did in class. I talked about differences between the House and the Senate. For example, how many members they have, how often they're elected, how many per state, all of that, and just the differences it makes concerning representation and lawmaking. Those are in my notes. They're also talked about during class. And then finally, we have 3 representation theories that we've gone over. Descriptive representation, meaning people who represent others who identify in similar ways than them. So women who represent women, Black Americans who represent Black Americans. Someone who has a child with a disease or a disability may represent people who have a similar health concerns, that kind of thing. It can range from anything from your gender and race and ethnicity to your religion, to your education, to your upbringing or your socioeconomic class. The constituency model of representation, this is those circles that are drawn within one another. That is not only in your notes, but it was also talked about in class on more than one occasion. And then the trustee versus delegate model of representation is, of course, also in your book and in your notes. The presidency, we went over already in the beginning as sort of an introductory lecture to the presidency. The Electoral College, how does it work and how does it represent us? Who does it overrepresent and who does it underrepresent? Executive orders is something that is in your book that I want you to look at to be prepared to talk about next week. And I will have a simple question about just what an executive order is on the exam. And an executive order is a rule written by the president or the president's office that has the force of law. And it is a tool used by presidents to increase their power, but it's also a tool used by presidents to manage the bureaucracy in the military, which they have power over. War powers, the Congress versus the president. One of the supreme examples of the presidential gains in power is in the Constitution. It specifically says the Congress shall has the power to declare war, not the president. The president is commander in chief, but the Congress has the power to declare war. And yet no wars have been declared since the year 1942. And there has barely been a year that we've not been involved in a formal international conflict. Vietnam War, Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. None of those were declared wars by Congress. So how does that work? How is that constitutional? Look at my notes and be prepared to discuss that again next week. But it will be, some of these concepts will be broadly presented on the exam, though they will not have the hardest questions, not as hard as Congress, which we've gone over in such detail. And then also Supreme Court nominations. I put this one on here because it's such an important piece of presidential politics that people will vote based on who a person is planning on nominating to the Supreme Court, rather than really on any other policy position. And so it's a very big power of the president to be able to say, I am the one for the next 4 to 8 years who will do all of the replacing on the Supreme Court. It's quite a bit of power, considering that the Supreme Court justices will remain in that job for life unless they choose to resign. I hope this exam review has, if nothing else, given you an idea of where to find the information. If you do not currently feel comfortable and confident that you have it, again, the exam will be open from tomorrow at 8 in the morning all the way until Monday. So if you feel like you have some weaknesses here, spend some time studying what you think that you have a less of a good grasp on, and feel free to reach out to me through the discussion forum. Other than that, that is all I have for you. I hope that this helps you, if nothing else, to feel more confident. And I will see you next week.